Okay, thank you, Bhargav, and welcome you all, especially uh, the new members to the study group. Uh, Today, I plan to make an argument about why left too should have its own idea of India. And after that, give some initial points that will be elaborated by in the coming study circles by different people. So what kind of idea of India will be appropriate for left? So first, why left should have its own idea of India, and what kind of idea of India will be appropriate for left? No. In the study circle started with the explicit purpose of starting from live political issues, developments, challenges, and see that in somewhat of deeper perspective, a theoretical political perspective. But our anchor always is politics of the day, what is happening in India and in the world today. So since in democracy dialogues, we were already discussing the issue of ascendance of Hindutva and Hindutva kind of fascism coming to power in center. We took that as our first objective to understand that, and our emphasis has been that even though Hindutva is a political challenge, is a political phenomenon, but in our discussion we went into the what kind of background or what kind of support does it receive from the Indian society itself. So most of the time when a political phenomenon gets discussed, the discussion and analysis is mostly confined to the doings and omissions and commissions of the political forces, parties, leaders, ideologies, and so on. And we know that Hindutva is a phenomenon of modern politics. And yet we had to answer the question that why does the political forces may have their own reasons to act in a certain way, but why does that gain support from the society at large, or significant support from society at large? And we came up with the understanding through the discussions in this study circle, as well as at elsewhere, that the Hindu-Muslim divide, that itself is not a creation of those political forces who would like to utilize that divide. So if that Hindu-Muslim divide is not roped into politics, it will not become active. But if it was not there in the society, then it cannot be activated and made that effective, as has been the case in the political arena. So it's a combination of two things. Hindu-Muslim divide stays in the social, resides in the social soil, social mind, so to speak. but it lays dormant. It gets activated by political forces, but the doings or not doings of political forces, the practices and behaviors of political forces cannot be understood if you do not also take into account what are the things that reside in the social mind, in the social soil itself. The reason I am bringing this out, that this will be important, the role of social soil will be important for the topic that we are now picking up, the 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 topic of nations and nationalisms of various kinds. So in that context, we saw that in the colonial period itself, communalism and nationalism, both these large-scale phenomena of modern politics, were born in the colonial period. We have dealt with, to some extent, the communalism issue, as Bhargav was saying. We started with the second half of 19th century, saw the beginnings of communal mobilizations from both the sides, the Hindu side as well as the Muslim side, that led to partition. Now the twin of communalism, at the same time, along with communalism, nationalism was born too. And we have to pick up that thread. So we have to talk about the other twin, namely nationalism. The difference in these two things are, as hopefully will become clear as we proceed, is that in case of Hindu-Muslim divide, in some ways, if you look at the social soil, relatively deeper layers of society come into play. Even if politics does not activate the Hindu-Muslim divide into the political arena, still that divide is there. Saying that Hindu-Muslim divide is there in the society is not necessarily a negative statement. It's just a statement of fact. If one says that Hindu-Muslim divide is there, that doesn't mean that the conflict or antagony or animosity between Hindus and Muslims, is a must. We did not come to that conclusion. We do not say that. We just factually recognize that these two religion-based large identities are part of Indian society and part of Indian history. No value judgment there, and no indication, no casting aspersions that they must fight and you cannot do anything about their antagony or their fight because it's exist in the deeper layers of Indian society. But if you come to the other twin, as I was saying, the question of nationalism that was born against the British, this is closer. This layer is not that deep in the sense that it is question of nationalism. The idea of nationalism is not an idea which has been there in Indian social mind for several hundred years or millennia or whatever. This is a more recent phenomenon. Nationalism is more explicitly a modern phenomenon. And nationalism was born primarily, first and foremost, against the British rule, against the colonial rule. The point to note is that nationalism, which led to independence and which led to birth of Indian Republic, is closer to the political arena, is more explicitly political. It gives rise to nation state first and foremost. And the political arena, the most important phenomenon in political arena is a state, is a rule, is government, is constitution, and so on. So it is very closely linked with, the question of nation is very closely linked with the political arena. In Hindu-Muslim divide case, you had to activate it. That lies deeper. You have to activate and make use of it. You have to mobilize people to make use of it in the modern political arena. Nation, on the other hand, very much defines in a way the political arena. So that is the difference between the two things. We are closer to the political reality when we discuss the question of nations and nationalism. And this has been coupled with the question of communalism being a very pronounced and very large scale phenomenon on the subcontinent, on the Indian subcontinent, right from the time of colonial rule or later period of colonial rule. The question of nation, what is Indian nation? What is the idea of India has been a very controversial and very complex issue. And that controversy continues till today. Different political forces in the political arena have very differing viewpoints about what India is and what is the idea of India. How should we conceive India in order to have an Indian nation state? The way nations have been traditionally defined, in European arena or elsewhere, or by political theorists, those definitions do not exactly fit into India as a whole, as a nation. So there are many complications there. This problem of India, or the idea of India, has been a vexing, very complex and troubling problem right from the beginning. If you take the example of Jawaharlal Nehru, whom we discussed at great length in our previous studies circle meetings, you see, he had a dilemma. He was, on the one hand, he was looking for an idea of India. Who is India? Who is Bharat Mata? He was trying to answer that question to himself. That was a burning question for him as independence approached. So he was trying to find some deeper layer in the Indian society and civilization, which can be comprehended, which can be understood as India, despite its enormous diversity and complexity, linguistic, religious, in some ways ethnic too, Indian subcontinent being so large, and the history having so many streams, merging into the what you will call entire history of India. He was looking for some underlying unifying factor, which will give unity to, or sustenance to, the unity of India as one nation state. That was one effort he was making. And at the same time, as independence approached and as partition was looming large, partition was being discussed, in the 1940s, closer to 1947, he also was very clear that you have to have a very strong center in the independent Indian subcontinent. If the very strong center is not a strong central rule, a centralized government with most of political power, if it does not have that, then it will be difficult to keep India together, and it will be difficult to proceed rapidly on the path of developing Indian society and Indian economy um, on a rapid and on a course of rapid development. So you see, on the one hand, he was looking for what is inside the Indian soil itself, which helps. What is the idea of India, so that you can have one Indian nation state, one united country. He was looking for those factors in history. And on the other side, he was being very practical. He knew that if a strong unifying force was not there in the form of a centralized state, it will be difficult to keep India together, and it will be difficult to make plans for all-round development of the entire complex country. So you see that dilemma in case of Jawaharlal Nehru. And if we look at our own movement, the left movement, in a way, even though we never, as our leaders of those times and our party of those times, even though it did not confront the question directly, that is part of the problem, I will argue, is with us, with left, this dilemma in principle remains for us too, for the left today, for that, as we were talking last time, or maybe in Hyderabad meeting, the left that we would like to imagine, the kind of left, united left that we would imagine should exist today in order to confront the complex reality of India and the world. So if that left were around, that left would have to come up with its own idea of India. Now, there has been a lot of discussion in left about nations and nationalism, and that has, in some ways, it goes on still till now. In the international communist movement, there has been a lot of discussion about the idea of nation, starting from Communist Manifesto, where Marx and Engels declared that workers have no country, so a very blunt and direct statement about working class, the proletariat, being internationalist in basic character, which implies that nationalism is an ideological construction or ideological design of the bourgeoisie as the ruling class. The idea of nation and nationalism arises with ascendance of capitalism in Europe, and bourgeoisie constructs this idea for the twin purpose of fighting the feudal, erstwhile feudal rulers whom they were displacing, as well as for the development, capitalist development in an area over which they can claim sovereignty, they can claim complete political control. So that our understanding, our theory starts from there. But after that blunt statement about internationalism, proletariat having nothing to do with nations and nationalism, actual history of left movement all over the world was forced to grapple with the question of nations and nationalism all the time. So those lot of theoretical innovation was done, and in a way was forced upon Marxists, on the question of nation and nationalism. I will not go into entire theoretical history of how nations have been understood, in a Marxist framework. The Marxist framework always emerged in a practical way, forced by developments in the political arena, in the global political arena, in the arena where revolutions had taken place, and wherever, in whichever political arena Marxists were present as an active political force. Always the theoretical innovation was done in order to meet the political challenge, given political challenge. That is the key point, and that is the approach we are taking too. We are going to deal with the idea of India and what keeps India together, and what approach do we have to a unified nation state for India. How do we understand that despite the diversity of language, religion, ethnicity, and everything else, India has the unity of India is almost given with few examples on the peripheries. The unity of India is almost given. And we among the leftists, whatever we have discussed about the right of nations for self-determination, including the right to secede, we have discussed that. And we have quarreled among ourselves about what is a nation, what is not a nation. Despite all that, the question of self-determination, including the right to secede, that has receded from, that is no longer very active political slogan force in any part of India. Again, there are parts of India where this question is live, but those are mainstream India, large part of India, that question has disappeared. And yet the question about how to conceive India and what is the relationship of Indian nation state to the idea of India, that question is not settled in the sense that you ask as many people, you ask as many answers you will get. Everybody has a separate answer to that. So in a way, we have to deal with, and one more thing I can add here, that not only we have to understand the reality, political reality, namely why is centralized Indian nation state is a given. Why is it, why has it become such a consolidated reality? Why the idea is so powerful? Understand that from Marxist perspective. We will say that understand nation without being nationalist in the usual sense. Usual means common sense that is prevalent in the society and among the most of the political forces. What is distinct about being Marxist while understanding nation, while understanding unity of India, what approach and what attitude to take? That question will have to be taken up directly. So that understanding the objective reality is one part, but that is not the only part. The other part is that it is a political need also. If left has paid a very heavy price for not being clear on the question of idea of India. So it has been easy to depict left as some alien ideology, and there have been instances, examples of left position on this question, the position of one or the other left force on this question, such that it can easily be painted that leftists are by their makeup anti-nationalists. Leftists are by makeup, they do not subscribe to the idea of India leading to one Indian nation state. That can easily be accusation has easily been thrown at left. And I am not suggesting that we are going to deal with this question only in order to get out of that awkward situation that left gets depicted as anti-national very easily and that left gets depicted as an alien ideology. I am not saying that we should do that only for our political convenience. I am saying that these two things are conjoined. We must understand the reality of India, beyond the issues of classes and class struggle, just the way we have been forced to try to understand caste and gender and many other things that cannot be understood exclusively along the class axis. We have been forced to try to understand that. Same way, nation or the idea of India cannot be understood only along this axis of classes and class interest and class struggle. So how do we incorporate that? How do we incorporate the idea of India into our Marxist understanding? That is a challenge in itself that we will have to understand. In any case, we are not doing this in order to prove ourselves as nationalists or patriots or whatever. I mentioned that left has been depicted more easily as anti-national because of the lack of clarity on what attitude does it have to the question of nation and to the question of idea of India. So it is both the things. I am giving the political need as an example that if you do not understand a large-scale question in a systematic way, and if you do not determine a correct attitude to large phenomena such as nation, an idea of India, an Indian nation state, what keeps it together, then apart from all the problems that arise from having lack of clarity, you can also be easily accused. You will say things or do things which will force that accusation on you. So, maybe I'm taking too much time on that, but this is a very important question. That's my point. It's a very important question objectively, and it is very important question for us as a political force too. Now, the question of nation, last point I will say before I move to rudiments of the theoretical framework that we need to discuss in future meetings. Having said about this much about the theoretical as well as political importance of the question of nation and the question of idea of India, let me also add that the way we started about communalism, when we spent almost a year on that question of communalism and partition and so on, that was forced on us by current politics. And the question of nation too is being forced on us by current politics. If we again look at Hindutva, again look at BJP, or again look at the present regime, even though Hindutva is their bedrock, Hindutva is their main plank, they don't live by Hindutva alone. They have to add question of nationalism to the question of Hindutva. And that is how their entire thesis of cultural nationalism comes about, in which they conceptualize and try to make it a reality what they call Hindu Rashtra. They conceive Indian nation as Hindu nation, in which other religious identities will be allowed to be citizens, but not equal citizens. So this challenge of the idea of nation is operating in the current politics too. That is the third dimension, that we have to understand nation as an objective political phenomenon. We have to understand nation as a Marxist should understand, and the attitude that it should take about nation, which is a non-class aspect of politics, related with class structure and class dynamics, but class dynamics does not exhaust it. And then third reason I am arguing why we should have the idea of India as a leftist, as a Marxist, is that you see the traction, the pull, the power to have mass following is dependent on not only on their Hindutva, but also on their idea of nation. And that is why in the last election in 2019, you can take that as an example, that despite their clear credentials regarding Hindutva, they were facing difficulty at the election time, and Pulwama happened, or was made to happen, whichever may have been the case. And then they swept over the elections. So you see, if the nationalist kind of euphoria can be generated, a certain kind of nationalist euphoria is generated, it has very direct day-to-day political repercussion. That also is forcing us to this question. We are being forced to this question, this very practical political question, also by the fact that the Hindutva is proposing one kind of idea of nation, Hindu Rashtra, one kind of idea of India. And there has been, before ascendance of Hindutva, a very definite idea of India, which led to a secular multinational Indian nation state, a secular nation state under that umbrella, there have been many nationalities, many languages, and diverse identities. That kind of secularism based on toleration, secularism based on states' equal respect for all religions, that have been there. And if you have that kind of idea, then necessarily, as we proceed theoretically in future meetings, we will see necessarily that idea of nation will be very different from the idea of a nation based directly on religion or ethnicity or one language or whatever. So you will see that you can have many different ways of conceiving a nation, many different ways of conceiving an idea of India. Two broad definition, you can give. And those of you who were in our last democracy dialogue lecture by Pranav Bardhan, he brought that out. You would remember that there is this civic nationalism, and there is another notion of nationalism, which is some kind of ethnic nationalism. The civic nationalism, which also can be said as liberal nationalism, is based on prior existence of a sovereign republic or a nation state, and whoever is citizen of that nation state, of that republic, the nationalism of that citizen is broadly speaking, that is civic nationalism. Whereas ethnic nationalism is nationalism of a pre-existing community, pre-existing ethnic group, pre-existing people, So even before nation state comes into play, that nation exists. And because that nation exists a priori, then it makes a claim to that nation state. So that is more closely linked with the idea of some ethnicity or some pre-given identity. That is the illiberal kind of nationalism that Pranav Bardhan was talking about. So this is the broadest division you can have: civic liberal nationalism versus ethnic illiberal nationalism. And the question we are faced with, is that we can understand our weakness of left, that we have become a weak force as such in the Indian politics today, but also we have not paid attention what kind of idea of India a Marxist should have in India. The Indian left should have what kind of idea of India. This puts us in a very weak position. But the question arises that why has the illiberal nationalism of Hindu Rashtra kind become now much more successful, has much more traction, attractive power for large segment of the masses compared to the civic nationalism? Why it is becoming difficult, having had someone like Nehru establishing that civic nationalism in India, and subsequent Congress governments, even if faltering, by and large sticking to that civic nationalism idea, how come the hegemony of civic nationalism was overcome by the today's hegemony of illiberal ethnic Hindu Rashtra kind of hegemony? That question is one of the very big questions of Indian politics, So the area of question is much larger than just the problem of left having an idea of India, So that's, we cannot escape this question. I mean, maybe I have not been very systematic, and yet my point is to look at the question of why do we as leftists need to have an idea of India from various perspectives. Having made the argument that we must grapple with the question of idea of India, as we grappled with the question of communalism, we must grapple with the question of what is the meaning of Indian nationalism, how India can be one nation, this question we cannot avoid. I have made the argument why we should deal with it so far. Now, let me just briefly indicate what kind of questions will arise from here, so that rest of next 15-20 minutes, I will take as outlining what kind of discussion our study group should take up, or what kind of investigation our study group should take up. In order to deal with this question, the question is, to repeat, how should an Indian Marxist, Indian leftist have his or her own idea of India? In order to settle that question, we are not the pioneers, or we are not the first one to deal with this question. A lot of discussion has taken place, and yet satisfactory conclusion has not been there in the history of our movement. So we will have to pick up more or less from the beginning, how to look at this question. And that brings us to some suggestive ideas about the theoretical framework under which the question of nation can be dealt with, under a Marxist framework. And it's not as easy, as I said, to go just with Communist Manifesto and declare that workers have no country. It doesn't help, because entire 150 years of left history since then has been, in one way or the other, occupied with grappling with the question of nation and the role it plays, in the politics on the ground. So, what kind of theoretical framework? One of the problems that we, quite some time ago, those of us who have been associated with NSI, even before NSI came into existence, we have been grappling with, like many Marxists and left political activists, we have been grappling with the question of this base superstructure model, the limitations of base superstructure model. You would know, most of you would know, we are all Marxists in one way or the other who are assembled here, that by base we mean largely we mean the economic foundation of society. In more accurate terms, we will say that the set of relations of production, characteristic of a given mode of production, for example, capitalism today or feudalism yesterday, the relations of social relations of production, or production's relations of social production, characteristic of a mode of production, constitute the economic base. That is what is meant by base. And very simple theory to grapple with the history of humankind at the largest possible scale says that that is the structure. The base is causally prior to other things. Causally prior means that causes, changes in the history. That is the foundation. I mean, that is the driving force of history. I mean, the story goes, deeper than that. The production relations themselves do not drive history. The development of productive forces drive history, and the production relations, when they are good for development of productive forces, that is when a mode of production does not run into crisis, given mode of production. But if the given mode of production, namely the given social relations of production, become a barrier to further development of productive forces, that is when the production relations will need change. And that is the era, as Marx said, that is the era of revolutions. Revolutions are needed because the given production relations, which had so far facilitated development of productive forces, were beginning to obstruct now the development of productive forces. So those relations become barrier, and those barriers must be removed for history to proceed. That was basically the materialist theory of history propounded by Marx, and in order to understand what else was there in the society beyond the social relations of production, the idea of superstructure was propounded. And superstructure is all the other, for example, state, governments, ideas, ideologies, cultural practices, traditions, habits of a society as a whole. All these things were put in the basket that was called superstructure. And this superstructure is a product of the base, given base, and serves that base. This was in roughly the base superstructure model. And it was propounded for a very different purpose by Marx. It was propounded because how does human history make progress? How does it proceed? So he was contending with idealist ideas about human history. And at that philosophical and very large scale level, he made the argument that material forces are behind the development of history or progression of history. That was the context in which this base superstructure model came. But this base superstructure model became a dogma for us, later Marxists, who were more than, who were often not equal to the task, the way Marx was, and this gave rise to how do you understand a very complex society and political reality in this base superstructure model. And if you look at the developments in 20th century Marxism, the entire discussion is, or large part of discussion is about how to overcome the limitations of this very mechanical base superstructure model. How do you reduce everything to economy? That economy is giving rise to religion, economy is giving rise to caste, economy is giving rise to patriarchy, economy is giving rise to all the different kinds of political movements and forces and phenomena. How do you incorporate the complex reality of history and human society in this model? How to overcome these limitations has been a large part of history of leftists, as far as their theory is concerned in the 20th century and even beyond. In the organized left, unfortunately, whatever has been attempted on this very difficult question, how to understand society, that very much basic question, in a way, we fail to understand even the first question, about society, if we insist mechanically on this base superstructure model. So largely the communist parties have not engaged with it in equal measure. You know, different communist parties have grappled with these questions in different measures. But there were very famous Marxist theorists associated with communist parties, who have made contributions on this question more important than the contributions made by the leadership of the communist parties themselves. And there, as history has shown, as the problem shows, their contribution, in hindsight, we can see were more important than the documents written by the committees of the communist parties. And those theoreticians often faced difficulties, even though they were members of communist parties, they faced difficulties with the leadership of those communist parties. I will just give you two examples. One example, I will give you two examples that we give. You must have heard those names. One name is Gramsci, who was a leader of the Italian Communist Party. And the other name is of Althusser, not related with each other theoretically, that much, but still a later leader in 20th century, mid 20th century, Althusser, who was associated with the French Communist Party. And both tried to grapple. And there are many, many examples. I am just, today we are not getting into all the discussions. I have to just introduce or make the proposal of why we should take up these questions in the study circle. Now, Gramsci, so I will just very hand-wavingly take these two names. Gramsci, for example, he wrote extensively while in jail, while dying in jail. He wrote thousands of pages, and one of the most remarkable communist intellectuals, theorist. It's a very long story. People have spent lifetime trying to understand his writings. But I will just say that he, for example, conceptualized two separate aspects of society. One he called political society, and the other he called civil society. Political society, by that, he largely meant the state. And by civil society, he largely meant all that comes in the private domain of social individuals. But private domain defined vis-a-vis state, defined as opposed to the political society. So, for example, private domain will have religion, private domain will have family, private domain will have the way individual conducts his or her life, in the family and in the community. All that will be in the private domain, but also certain movements also will be in the private domain. For example, he put even trade unions in the domain of civil society. So you see, civil society, when you say private, that may create a misimpression, a wrong impression. Private does not mean just the family, just the individual. It also remains other aspects of individual's life, immersed in the community, maybe immersed in the working place also, but different from the realm of a state, different from the political arena, outside the direct political playing field. Now, so this state and private dichotomy he made because he was trying to understand many things. He was trying to understand in a Marxist framework, but one thing he was trying to understand was also nation. So before nation, he came up with, we come to the question of nation, he came up with this idea of hegemony. His idea was that the ruling class, which in the case he was considering the bourgeois ruling class, the capitalist ruling class, does not rule by coercion alone. Largely, it rules by consent. So it receives consent from the ruled, people who are ruled, from the people over which that rule exists in the form of a state. That a state draws consent from the people. So that is the linkage he establishes between political society and civil society. And the consent, if it is received by the state from the civil society, that is what he gives it's the name of hegemony. That the ideological hegemony of the rulers over the ruled, over the society, is established through consent given by the people to the state, and in that acquiring of consent, this the role of civil society is important. Now, he also came up with the question of war of position, two concepts: war of position and war of maneuvers, war of maneuvering. War of position is the struggle for establishing hegemony. Hegemony in itself is not a bad word. No, he conceptualized that yes, hegemony is usually that of the ruling class, but there can be a counter hegemony. Hegemony can also be roped into for the revolutionary purpose. So the revolutionary forces can try to establish their own hegemony. Let us, to keep it clear, call that counter hegemony. So the counter hegemony has to be established, and then the hegemony of the ruling class must be countered with revolutionary counter hegemony. And this thing he called war of positions. War of position, he conceptualized, will be the usual way of usual strategy of revolutionaries in capitalist systems, in bourgeois societies. Exception was war of maneuver as it happened in October Revolution, when the first proletarian revolution took place. That was not the result of a war of position. That was an example of what he called war of maneuver. War of maneuver is when, without establishing counter hegemony in the society, because of very special conditions in the society, as well as the very special weaknesses of the state that revolutionaries want to overthrow, because of very special condition, without counter hegemony, you can win state power. The revolutionaries can win state power. That was an example of war of maneuver. War of maneuver, in his understanding, was exceptional. Mostly we will be confronted with the question of war of position. So mostly we will be confronted with the question of how to establish a counter hegemony in the society. This question of hegemony, then he brought that concept to the question of nation also. And he talked about national popular will. National popular will can be constructed. National popular will be constructed, that can be constructed in support of hegemony, and national popular will can also be constructed in support of counter hegemony. So constructing a national popular will, that road is open both to the rulers and to the revolutionaries. That's a very important thing to keep in mind. So he is saying that even the revolutionary strategy will need creation of some kind of national popular collective will that will confront the national popular will based on consent given to the rulers, based on consent given by the society to the rulers. That will have to be confronted in the war of position by a counter hegemony that will try to create a national popular collective will opposed to that of rulers' hegemony. You see, that's it's a very complex, theorization that he does in thousands of pages, sitting in jail and dying. He was writing continuously, you know. Um, um, but I am just trying to give you an example of how people have very seriously grappled with this challenge of how to overcome the limitations of a base superstructure model. Now, just keep this in mind. That's where I'm, we don't have much time today, so I will stop Gramsci at that. Keep that in mind, and as we proceed, and in your mind, you will try to fit what Gramsci is saying into what comes into base and what comes into superstructure, and you cannot easily fit that in, all that into one or the other. You will have to make the concept of base and superstructure both very flexible in order to understand what Gramsci is trying to grapple with. Althusser, who came, to bloom in 1950s and 60s, so about 30 years, 40 years later than Gramsci, 30 years later than Gramsci, he also was grappling with that question. He was associated with the French Communist Party, and later on he left or he was expelled. I don't know which. He had difficulties with French Communist Party. He tried to conceptualize entire society in three domains. That, he said, not very difficult to understand, roughly, is economic, political, and ideological. So, economic, of course, is the standard definition, which is the set of relations of social productions. That is the economic base. And political, again, is related to state and to the political arena. But he defined ideological in a very complex way, and that ideological overlapped with what, not exactly, but in some way it overlapped with what Gramsci had called civil society. And this ideological had, included the private domain and included all the ideologies, that reign in the society. And his effort was that we should not be forced to derive entire ideological domain from the economic domain, even though that question was never settled in his theory fully. So he was forced to say that in the final instance, or in the last instance, economy is the determining factor. He had to say that, but he had a very complex theorization, about the ideological, because he was trying to overcome the limitations of base superstructure model, and he was trying to escape the compulsion that everything in the ideological domain must emerge from the economic base. And in that ideological domain, then many things will come, that which are non-class aspect. And he came up with this very difficult idea, which very difficult to understand. I do not understand it fully. Is the concept of over-determination, that things are not determined linearly by one cause giving rise to one effect. Over-determination means many things determine one thing, and that which is a consequence also becomes a cause, and so on. I will not go into the detail now. If we feel the need in future meetings, we can take that up. What my purpose right now is to show that much of Marxist theory has been concerned with those things which are not class related. No, I shouldn't say class related. Everything is related to class. So they are class related, but they are not derived from class. They are separate from or different from the class dimension of social reality. So there are other things in the society which can be separated, at least conceptually, they can be separated from the class dimension. These efforts have been there, and there are many other efforts too. Now, many of you know that in NSI, for years, we have been having, in order to understand today's politics and today's social reality in India and elsewhere, we have come up with this practical theoretical framework, you can say, which we divide between system and rest of society. Everything is society. So the system is also part of society. So for want of a better word, if we subtract or distill or abstract away the system from society, whatever is left over, we call it rest of society. It is very much similar to what Gramsci called civil society. But there are differences too. There will be, theory is always constructed or chiseled, or details of theory depend on what purpose you want to construct a theory for. Theory is not absolute in that sense. So we have some differences with that. In future we have to learn more about that. What is the meaning of what we say, whether that is consistent or not, whether that is free of internal contradiction or not. That is an unfolding story. We don't know everything. But roughly speaking, we divide the society between system and rest of society. And in system, we have the economic base plus the politics that comes directly out of it. The politics that comes out of it is the class politics. That aspect of a state, for example, which preserves class interest of the ruling classes. That aspect of constitution, which protects the property rights, through which capitalist mode of production, survives, or unfolds, or is based on. So the economic base, material base of the society, and that part of political superstructure, which is directly related to class politics or class axis. Together, these two things we call system. And then everything else goes in the other part. And again, the model is not very clean. So there are, in the superstructure, for example, there are other things, which intrude into the political superstructure, but they are not directly related to class structure. So, for example, if there is a law in the constitution that talks about how people should get married, one individual marrying another is not exactly a class question. I'm not getting into all the feminist debates right now. Many feminists will say that it is a class question. But the way I am defining class in terms of the economic social relations of production, marriage is not a class question. It's a question of oppression, no doubt. But not a class question, to keep things simple and clear. And yet there are laws in the constitution or in the rule book about marriage. So marriage becomes part of the political superstructure. So there are part of political superstructure which is not class related. So those unclean boundaries are there. But by and large, we can define system roughly in a practical way, and rest of things we put in the rest of society. Now, where does nation come in our framework? That is a question that we will need to grapple with. It is easy to put religion in rest of society, away from system. It is easy to put caste and gender in rest of society, away from system, away from class structure. But what do we do with nation and the question of nationalism? What do we do with the question of idea of India? That will be our new challenge. That is what we will have to understand in this theoretical framework. This will be linked with the fact that the idea of India and the political role it plays is closer to the political superstructure, is closer to the state, is closer to the politics that unfolds in society in order to constitute the state, in order to elect a government, and so on. So it is not as deeply entrenched. The idea of nation is not as deep in the ground, in the social ground, as Hindu-Muslim divide is, as religion is, as caste is, as patriarchy is, Indian version of patriarchy is. Not that deep layer of the social mind and social soil. But can we say that the idea of nation is only in the political arena? In our framework, it will appear that it overlaps the boundary between the system and rest of society. So there are phenomena, there are beasts whose one leg in the system domain and whose other leg is in the society domain. In the system domain, it gives rise to nation state. Nation state, is a state for a nation. So there is no global state today. India as a sovereign country has its own state, So that is Indian nation state or Indian multinational state, whichever way you put it. But one state, unified state is there. So to whichever way, the idea of India is needed to proclaim the sovereignty of Indian Republic, sovereignty of Indian state, To that extent, the idea of nation and idea of India overlaps with the political superstructure part, which is one part of the system. But we don't, and that is, I am guessing what will be the outcome of our theoretical framework, and we will have to elaborate it in future discussions, which is that if we say that nation entirely falls in the political superstructure arena, then we have a very thin, very mechanical, very wooden version of idea of nation. It falls very close to the idea of civic nation. It is even more thinner version of civic nation. Even civic nation will give room to some extent to role of something of the national phenomenon falls in the society domain. So we cannot put everything in the political superstructure domain, everything about nation. That means part of the idea of India, part of idea of Indian nation falls in the society domain, not in the system domain. Now, whenever we make all these divisions, whether Gramsci did so, Althusser did so, or we are trying to do in another way for our practical problem, these divisions are conceptual divisions. Everything is linked. In real life, everything operates together. In real life, system does not operate separate from society. When we are saying that nation partly falls in the society domain, of course, the part that falls in the society domain also links up with the system domain, with the state, with the nation in the form of nation state. It links up with the state. But each time, if we keep repeating that everything is connected, everything is linked, then no theory will be constructed. Each time a theorist, does some conceptual abstraction, conceptual divisions, and you attack that theory saying that, oh, that is a very artificial division. In society, it doesn't happen like that. In society, everything is connected. That's not a valid attack on trying to understand. Understanding of anything for a theorist or for anybody else, even those people who pride on not being theorist, to paraphrase somebody, I will say that they do not know that they are followers of some third grade theorist. So everybody is a theorist. Without theory, you don't understand anything. You don't know that when you are trying to make sense of anything, in your head, some theory is operating. You are not conscious of that theory. So it is best to be conscious of a theory, not be unknowing follower of a bad theorist. So most common sense people, without their knowing, unknowingly, they are followers of invariably very bad theorists, outdated theorists. So it is very good thing to be consciously being a theorist. For practical political reasons, you must be consciously a theorist. And when we do as a theorist these divisions, then we will have to explore that. You can explore the state part of nation state in the system domain, but you cannot explore the society part of nation state, many would call nation part of nation state, in the system domain. You will have to go into the domain of society. And hence, you will have to go into the domain of the history of a given society. What has happened in the history of that society, and history has deposited what kind of selective memories in the mind of that society, and which memories are activated by which kind of politics. You will have to deal with that question. So when it comes to nation, the same problem will confront us. We will have to answer the question that what do we mean by idea of India? So it is easier for some people to say that idea of India is decidedly Hindu, and that idea of India, Hindu idea of India, was spoiled or was destroyed or by Islamic invasion. Otherwise, so idea of India resides in pre-Islamic ancient past, that roughly speaking will be the idea of India for Hindutva brigade, who would like to wipe out the Islamic middle part of Indian history. And they are unclear about what to do with the colonial part, because in the colonial modern part, they collaborated with the British, and now they claim to be nationalists. So when there was time for being nationalist, they were not nationalist, And when that kind of nationalism, anti-colonial nationalism, has gone out of agenda of history, now they are beating their chest about being nationalists. So what do they do about the colonial period or modern period? Let us leave it to them. They have to determine what attitude to take. The civic nationalism in India arose in the anti-colonial nationalism, that idea that was clearly defined, but that faces difficulty in the independent India. When colonialism goes out of history, then how can you use anti-colonialism as the main plank of your nationalism? So many leftist and many communist parties, do a lot of intellectual exercise, gymnastics, to extend colonialism in some way, because they need some kind of colonialism, or let us say imperialism. They extend the theories of imperialism so that the anti-colonial need of nationalism survives, so that they can say that we are a nation vis-a-vis imperialism. So you see, that brings us to this question of nation, that there are two lines of this argument. Nation is defined by two things. One, I can say, us versus them nation, where nation or idea of India is defined vis-a-vis something external. In the period when nationalism was born in India, it was defined against colonialism, and that was a very clearly identifiable, definition. So that was an example of us versus them nation. But that us versus them nation becomes more complicated in the post-independence period. So post-independence period, then you have to come up with, more complicated definitions. Of course, I am not ruling out that is still us versus them nation is possible. Even in independent India, us versus them nation is possible on two grounds. Left emphasizes the imperialist ground, that Indian nation is needed because in order to stand against imperialism, especially Western imperialism, we need Indian nation. So left will say that Indian nation is largely still us versus them nation, and them are Western imperialism, and whoever on the Indian soil is against them, that is us. That is the definition of leftist definition, commonplace definition of Indian nationalism. But us versus them nation is also utilized or also deployed on cultural or other identity grounds too. So we can say, let me say that let us for now say that, let us assume that China is not imperialist. I'm not saying that China is not imperialist. I'm just assuming that China is not imperialist. So vis-a-vis Chinese, non-imperialist Chinese, still we are Indians. Vis-a-vis, when China was decidedly not imperialist, which was 1962, there was a war between China and India, and the communist internationalists would say that China is the seat of socialism and we are internationalists, so we don't have to stand with the Indian nationalists to fight against the Chinese. And obviously that was a wrong thing. That will be a wrong line to have. Obviously, I'm saying, but is it so obvious? On what basis do you say that it is wrong? If you say, if a communist in India says that China is socialist and there is a war between socialist China and capitalist India, or feudal India, whichever way you put it, then it is obvious that we stand with with socialism. And now we are saying that that is obviously wrong, to say that we stand with China in China-India war. So why am I saying that it is obvious that that's a wrong position? We will have to think about that. So we know intuitively, we know what is the right position, but we don't know why it is a right position. And that is the problem we are posing. So there are many ways in which us versus them nation can be defined, versus imperialism, versus other nations, and so on. So us versus them nation can be defined also vis-a-vis other nations. But that is not enough. That also is a thin definition of nationalism. Depending on others to define us is a thin definition, is not very effective, not very robust, not very powerful definition of us. So we have to go to the other question, other axis of nation, namely, who are we nation? So there is one definition of nation, us versus them nation, and there is another definition, who are we? That question, answer that question, and that will define a nation. So both these things, us versus them nation and who are we nation, both these things are needed. If you do not have who are we part of nation definition, then it will be a thin definition, and that somebody or the other will come up with some idea, even if wrong idea of who are we, then that idea will pick up a lot of popular support because that defines who are we. And then we will be at a loss. We will say that, oh, we are not just Hindus, we are Indians. We are not just Hindus. We are Hindus and Muslims and Christians and Sikhs, So we are Indians. But then somebody will come and they will say that we are Indians because we are Hindus. So this is who are we definition of a nation. And then we will have trouble, because when somebody clearly defines that we are Indians because we are Hindus, then it gets a very attractive traction, a lot of attractive force among the large part of masses. Why does it give a lot of attractive force? Because this is a deeper idea than the idea of civic nationalism, than the idea of nationalism defined only on the basis of citizenship. Citizenship is only 70-year-old, and who are we is thousands of years old. And whatever phenomena, who are we if it is thousands of years old, and somebody defines rightly or wrongly who are we, then you cannot contend that definition of who are we with saying that, oh, we are Indians. They are asking who is Indian, and you are saying that we are Indians. So if somebody is asking who is Indian, can you answer by saying that we are Indians? That is the problem. In nutshell, that is the problem of civic nationalism politics as well as left politics too. That we have, in order to answer who are we only say that we are Indians. And I have already argued that you cannot escape this question. You cannot, Marxism, Marxist theory and Marxist politics cannot escape the question of nation. So cannot escape the idea of India. And if it cannot escape the idea of India, it cannot define idea of India by Indian Republic, by Indian Constitution alone. When somebody asks who is an Indian, you cannot say that we are Indians. So that is where the question is. It is as clear as that. It is a burning political question for left, and left is not answering that. So let me now conclude by saying that we are proposing to take this twin of communalism, which is nationalism, as the next phase of our study. It is a very large question, theoretically complex question, and practically, politically very important question. We are very small people, a small group of people. We always ask questions which is way above our pay grade. We always ask our questions that bigger people should answer, bigger parties should answer, bigger leaders should answer. And because they are not answering, we are forced to grapple with that question, because we cannot make sense of the world in which we want to act in a small way. So that is what we say, that we try to think on behalf of entire left, even though we are nobodies. And this has taken us here. Now we take up the question of idea of India. We must, because left must take up this question. The weakness of left, there are many reasons for weakness of left, but this is a very large region, large cause, very deep cause for left's weaknesses over a long period of time in Indian political arena. And in the end, very end, I will say that no matter how small people we are, no matter how less prepared we are to ask very large questions and answer very large questions, we must ask and we must answer. Only thing that is demanded of us is to become passionate about it. Ask these questions and try to answer these questions as if your life depends on it. It is not something that we do as theoretical political entertainment. NSI and NSI study circle is not a place for theoretical entertainment. Is not a place where after you have done everything in life, if you find time, you come for a few hours here too. This is a big responsibility. Nobody has given us this responsibility, but we have taken this responsibility. And you will see that your political personality as a left political activist will undergo very deep-seated change, will improve a great deal if you try to answer for yourself the question that stares in the eyes of entire left. So this is very serious business. Let us take it seriously. Let us expand our circles and let us deepen our own commitment and knowledge. No matter how laughable we are in terms of our numbers and our influence in the society, the questions we are asking and the sincerity with which, rigor with which we are trying to answer those political questions, that makes us an important component of left. So let us also have the commitment and responsibility worthy of being an important component of left. Thank you.
Sir,
Thank you very much, Ravi.
sir, no, I'm totally convinced with the proposal of the two types of nations. We are there, that is there, we understand it. But who are we? How we define the Indians? Who is India? As per the left, who is Indian? I want more elaboration on this.
I will take 10-15 minutes, because that is the question. Again, I will give a proposal, not the answer of what Khan Sahab is asking, but that is the question we are trying to grapple with. I have a few ideas which we have discussed, partly in Hyderabad meeting and partly among ourselves, but I plan to elaborate in future meetings. So who are we for the leftist? First thing I will say is that we that I am defining as Indian is a historical category. So it is not a religious category. It is not a linguistic category. It is not an ethnic category. It is merger of all those, but it is a historical category. So what do I mean by historical category? We will have to go into, first we have to decide that whatever happens in the confines of India, in the geographical boundaries of India, if you try to construct some kind of cultural, social, civilizational personality to India that lives in the boundaries of India, or more generally within the boundaries of the subcontinent, that culture and civilization for us is history of this region, history of this India. So what construct us? Our history construct us. Our history has this natural geographical boundaries. Our history, and that we have to explore, we have to elaborate. Our history has this civilizational history that somehow India, the subcontinent, emerged, which was different from Middle East, which was different from Europe, which was different from China, which was different even from Far East, I mean, whether Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia, whatever, So this here we are taking help of us versus them kind of definition. But we are not taking that as the definition, us versus them definition. We are just starting our exploration that what kind of things have happened in this boundary, between Afghanistan and Burma, between, from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, what has happened in 2 or 3 thousand year history, which has given rise to what has commonly been known as Indian civilization. So this is a common term, Indian civilization, that all historians and all people, anthropologists, as well as political theorists use that, Indian civilization as vis-a-vis Chinese civilization, vis-a-vis Islamic civilization, or Iranian civilization, or Greek civilization, whatever, So whatever we call Indian civilization by common sense, what is going to be our understanding of that civilization? That is the question we are asking in order to answer who are we. And that we see not in terms of religion, not in terms of language, as I said, but in terms of entire history. In that entire history, there has been this effort by Marxist theorists to look at this entire history in terms of modes of production. That Asiatic mode was there, and the feudal mode was there, and then capitalism came, and so on. And that if you want to reduce Indian history to history of successive mode of productions, then there are very difficult questions it is not possible to answer them. And that in that kind of analysis of Indian history, many famous Marxists and non-Marxists too, including Marx, who said that he is not a Marxist, he said that India doesn't have history. The pre-modern India, pre-British India doesn't have history. And that many people become very angry, especially post-colonial theorists become very angry with Marx saying that India doesn't have history, because they say that, look, even Marx is an Orientalist. He is a Western racist who thinks that all non-European societies are devoid of history. So what I'm pointing out is that there are all these complications where it is very difficult to understand Indian history merely in terms of history of mode of productions, history of economic systems. So other things will come in. And we are back to the question we are asking, that can history be sum total only of class relations and mode of production, or other things will have to be brought in? And we are saying that other things will have to be brought in. So we will concentrate on the other things. When needed, we will go to the history of economic systems too. What was the economy in Mughal times and so on. One can go to, as Professor Irfan Habib went into that famously. But our main concern will be history as a whole. And in that, especially the cultural civilizational history. And there will be two things I will say in just a few minutes and then stop. There are very difficult questions. I will put it in two ways and elaborate it in future meetings. One question arose when we were discussing among ourselves and in some of our public platforms too. Why did India, who is acknowledged as being a great civilization in ancient times and even in medieval times, why did India, which until Aurangzeb's time, until 1707, was producing almost one third of world GDP, which was taken as the richest country or one of the richest countries along with China in the world. Why did we become colonized? And why have we landed up in this very sorry state where we produce not more than 3 or 5% of the world GDP? We were producing 30% of it. So people say that is not because we were left, that is because Europe forged ahead. But then we ask the question, why did Europe forge ahead, and why did everybody else, including Indians, were left behind? This question is known as Needham question. Needham was a scientist, a chemist, but he devoted most of his life in understanding that China, which was a much more advanced civilization compared to Europe, why was China left behind Europe? Why did scientific revolution happen in Europe, which was a very barbaric society compared to China? And that is, so why did China got left behind? That is famously known as Needham question. We need to generalize that question and ask that question for ourselves, that why did India have this plight, which was at the top of the world few hundred years ago, and now it is at the bottom of the world? Don't be fooled by this third largest economy or whatever. Per capita income, if you were insist on those kind of indices, is the index, and in that we are below 100. We are still among the poorest society in the world. And we know all the other problems of our society, along with poverty, the kind of superstition, the kind of wretched society we are, where the kind of things, the riots that happen, what happens with children, what happens with women, all the wretchedness of our society we know very well. So let us not fool ourselves that we are the third largest economy. We are among the worst in the world. How did that happen? That Needham question is asked, and we need to ask that, in order to define ourselves, in order to understand who we are. There, in future, hopefully, we will discuss that why did great civilizations emerge? And there, one concept we will come up with, attributed to one philosopher, Karl Jaspers, which is called axial civilizations. Those civilizations flourished several thousand years ago, or 2,000 years ago. The civilizations where the idea of transcendent, idea of what the universe is like, idea of what God is and what religion is, idea of not outside this world, those concept about the, in Hindi we call it Paralaukik Vishwa, beyond this worldly world. The ideas about the transcendent were deployed into ordering this world. So in which certain kind of religion, which came through an elite, a prophet, or a book, or some very well-defined ideas of a very small minority, the idea came from top and percolated into the society. Some of those societies were called axial civilizations. And these great ideas percolating from top transformed the society in a fundamental way. Those societies that were transformed by those transcendental ideas, bringing into this worldly affairs, were called axial civilizations. And that is how past great civilizations, some of the past great civilizations were explained. India being part of that, China being part of that, Greece being part of that, and so on. Now, the reason I am bringing this thing is that compared to that, you have the other ideas, which is the populist idea. Populist idea is that the good things in society emerge from below, emerge from people. So popular movement give rise to great historical advances and developments. That is the idea which is very easily acceptable and is prevalent in our movement, in the left movement, because we say everything arises out of people, and people make revolution, and people make all kinds of revolutions, including intellectual revolutions, scientific revolutions. So we dwell on people and popular movements. And there are many, many other movements too, which are populist, which emphasize the contributions of movements from below. That can be contrasted with the idea of axial idea, that ideas come from top, great ideas come from top, and that elite, then driven by the need to transform the society for the better, takes those ideas to the people. That is the vanguard concept of history, the vanguard concept of political force. So the vanguard concept of political force, that also has been popular in our movement. Party is considered a vanguard. Leninist vanguard is much talked about. The vanguard concept of role of political forces has been popular in our movement, and that matches with the axial civilizations, the great developments in axial civilization. And the populist understanding of movement, that matches with the movement from below. So we have to now decide that India was made from the top or from below. Of course, it was made from both. Again, conceptual divisions, are not how society operates. India was made from top as well as it was made from below. But we have to understand at what phase in history which played the important role. And there, when we discuss that, we will see that if you see at Indian history and long view of Indian history from top, you will see that we had the Sanskritic era, from especially from 200-300 years before Christ to 500 years after Christ, those 700-800 years. But you can include the Buddhist time in that too, prior to that era, or you can include the Vedic times in that too. So the way we will define the Sanskritic era will not be defined by the Vedic era or by the Buddhist era, but that can be included in that. The peak of Sanskritic era came when this great battle between Sanatan Dharma and Buddhism was taking place, and Buddhism itself was forced to adopt Sanskrit as its medium of expression and communication, because the initial Buddhism did not use Sanskrit. It was largely Pali, in which the older Buddhist literature comes in. But anyway, let me not go into details right now. Let me define Sanskritic era. And then there was a gap of few hundred years. And then the Persianate era comes from top, where rulers in the medieval times, after all the dust settles of what is known as Muslim invasion of India, in 200-300 years, Islam becomes part of India. Muslims become Indians, they live here, and they become integral part of India. When that dust settles and another dimension is added to Indian civilization, then comes that Persianate era. This is from the top. Rulers were using Persian as the ruling language, and high literature was being produced in Persian, and gradually Urdu was being born. Hindavi was being born, so to speak. So this Persianate era, and then again the decline of Persianate era, 100 or 200 years, and then India is ready to receive the colonialists. India, whenever a great era ends, then India is ready to receive some invader. We only blame the invader. but we don't look at ourselves that why do we become ready to receive invaders? Because invaders come, few thousand of them. How come few thousand of them come, whether from the Khyber and Bolan passes or in their ships, on Chennai and Calcutta ports, and they take over all of India. That is because there comes a period in our long history when we are ready to receive even small invaders and hand over our society to them. In case of the medieval period, they became Indians. So now India cannot be defined without Persianate era. India cannot be defined without Muslims. The Britishers did not come and stay here. They did not become Indians, but they left something behind that became Indian, and that is modernity. So we have our Indian modernity that came in the form of Indian state, Indian citizen, secularism, in the form of all Indian citizens being equal and so on. These are aspects of modernity. And when this modernity is planted on the Indian soil, the harvest of modernity that comes on Indian soil, that becomes Indian modernity. So even though the Britishers left, but they left something behind here that became an integral part of us. So from top, from the rulers, from the elite, from science and philosophy and ideas, we define India from top. It is defined by Sanskritic era, Persianate era, and modern era. But what about India from bottom? India from below? In the cultural civilizational sense, there are many things happened. Many vernacular languages arose as opposed to Sanskrit and Persian. Many local languages arose. Some of those vernacular local languages became regular languages, produced literature in them, defined linguistic identity of those nationalities. Some others did not develop that. My own mother tongue, Bhojpuri, did not become a regular language. Braj Bhasha or Awadhi, even though it has literature in medieval times, did not become that kind of language. So Hindi land does not have the example of vernacular language becoming full-fledged languages in which high literature is produced. But Tamil became, Kannada became, Malayalam became, Bangla became, even Punjabi became that kind of language, vernacular language advancing to. So that was a movement from below. The largest movement from below was the Bhakti movement, which progressed across the entire subcontinent for more than 1,000 years, starting in Tamil Nadu and coming all the way to north, Hindi heartland. It took 1,000 years, and that defined the society from below. So Indian society from below is constructed by Bhakti movement. And what kind of position we take, that India defined from top by Sanskritic, Persianate, and modern era, and India defined from bottom in vernacular languages and Bhakti movement, which side we take? That is the question we are asking. The standard answer is that we take the side of the people. So we say that Bhakti movement was glorious, and Sanskrit is Brahminical. Sanskrit is to be thrown out. Persian is a foreign language. Good that it was thrown out. Modernity is alien to India. So we will accept part of modernity, but we will say that everything that the colonial masters brought was bad. So they obstructed India's growth. They did not bring anything good to India, anything worthwhile to India. They obstructed India's history. They were one of the worst developments in India history. That is the approach to colonialism that much of left has. Should we take that approach where Sanskrit is junked and declared Brahminical? We are totally opposed to that. Persianate era was Muslim ruling class. And even though we stand with all minorities, and we stand with Muslims, but we don't stand with the Muslim rulers of the medieval times, hence throw out the Persian. Modernity, throw out because it was colonial to begin with. Support only the vernacular languages, local languages, and say that only glorious thing that happened in Indian society was Bhakti movement because that fought against caste system and that was pro people, Are we going to take that position, or are we going to say that India, the making of India is more complex than that? Everything has gone into making of this India. The Sanskritic era, the Persianate era, the modern era, the vernacular languages, and the Bhakti movement. All of this has amalgamated to make us special, who can be identified culturally and civilizationally as Indians. We have to answer that question, and then we will be able to answer Khan Sahab's question that who are we? Who are Indians? How do we define Indians? So I'll stop at that.